Hey folks, here's our first bonus episode as I really wanted to discuss the 1980 film Saturn 3 as part of our discussion about homicidal robots. This is a film that has a huge significance to me, mainly because of how young I was when I saw it. My father opened his video store in 1980, and one of the very first films he had in his store was Saturn 3, which came out the same year. Saturn 3 has a dark tone, and much like the previously discussed Demon Seed, is as much horror as it is sci-fi. While there's certainly influence from both Alien and Star Wars at work here, there's a real gothic sensibility to Saturn 3. Tonally, it has more in common with the dystopian science fiction films of the late 70s and the emerging space operas post-Star Wars. In addition, it's more influenced by 2001 and Frankenstein than some of its other contemporaries. 1980 was the same year that The Empire Strikes Back was released, along with other space operas such as Flash Gordon and Battle Beyond the Stars, which may help explain why Saturn 3 was not a hit and also critically panned at the time of its release. It features a great cast, sensational production design, an incredible score, and one awesome robot. It's also kinda freaky, kinda scary, and kinda weird. In other words, it bears little resemblance to the safe, paint-by-number blockbusters of today. It walks a line between art house and sci-fi spectacle, and for sci-fi horror fans, I think it's a must-see. Granted, I'm biased, as this odd little film made a profound impact on me as a young child. Joining me to unpack this sci-fi cult film is Australian filmmaker Gregory Moss. Greg, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. Well, thank you so much for joining me at such an early hour where you are in Australia. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your relationship with this film?
So I've been a movie fan since I was very young, since I was a child, basically. I remember my parents taking me to the drive-in, in fact, when I was very young. One of my earliest memories of watching a movie would be Steven Spielberg's Duel back in the day. In 73.
Great film.
Yeah, I was 8 years old, and I think I was meant to be asleep in the back of the station wagon, but I was actually awake and watched the entire movie, and that really sparked my fascination with movies, with, telling stories in a visual sense. And that kind of sparked me to get into filmmaking as a career, which I'm currently doing.
Excellent. And what about in your relationship with Saturn 3? Because I discovered you because I had discovered your website years ago, and I was always a fan of the film Saturn 3, but I was unaware of all the kind of insane behind the scenes making of the film. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with this particular film and what possessed you to kind of dive so deep into this kind of bizarro little cult sci-fi film?
Well, when the film came out in 1980, my collection of magazines like Starlog and Fantastic Films and Starburst and Fangoria and that kind of thing, I was well aware of the film coming out 6 months before it came to Australia. In Australia at the time, we were lagging behind the rest of the world as far as movies coming out. So I was well aware of the film. I was well aware of problems that were behind the scenes just through my reading of these magazine articles. And so I was so looking forward to the film. Also, it being a gothic horror in space, there was nothing like that up to that point. And I was a lover of Hammer films, the gothic horror Frankenstein films particularly. So to have a film which mixed gothic horror and set in space was really kind of unique at the time. And so that really piqued my interest.
How long did it take to research all this? Because there is so much information on your website. It's like the definitive site to go to find out everything you'd ever want to know about the making of this film. How long did it take you to compile all this and put this into a website?
Well, originally I never really set out to make a website. Originally I have a blog which I started in 2012, and I was doing a series on troubled movie productions, and I decided I'd already done Piranha 2, and I thought the next one would be Saturn 3. So I went back through all the magazine articles that I collected over the years and realized that the article was actually much longer than I had anticipated. Too big for my blog. So I thought, well, I'll just set up a dedicated site and put the article on there and just see what happens. And pretty much as soon as I did that, fans started flocking to it. And so it became like a hub for fans of the movie. And it was fantastic realizing that I wasn't alone in my love of the film, that there were other people all around the world from everywhere who appreciated the film as much as I did. So it was fantastic connecting with all these fans. once I realized the site was up and running and it was kind of like functioning as a fan site, I really wanted a number of things to happen. And one of those things was to have the film released on Blu-ray. And I kind of hoped that whoever had the rights to the Blu-ray would approach me, to help put the Blu-ray together. And that's exactly what happened with Shout Factory, Screen Factory. They actually approached me, and I became heavily involved in the putting together of that Blu-ray with all my kind of research. I did the commentary track.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. That was one of the things I wanted to happen. The other thing I wanted to happen was get in contact with people who actually worked on the film, like have them reach out to me. And that ultimately happened with Colin Chilvers, who was the special effects artist who worked on Superman the movie, won an Oscar for that. And so he reached out to me, and we sort of, exchanged emails, and so I learned even more about the film. So that was fantastic.
Amazing, amazing. As we mentioned, the film had a crazy production history. Greg, can you kind of discuss how this project was initially developed before it was greenlit?
Yeah, well, really, the genesis of the idea came from John Barry, who's the production designer who worked with Stanley Kubrick on A Clockwork Orange. He also famously won an Oscar for Star Wars in '77. He also worked on Superman the movie as well. And back in 1975, he was working with Stanley Donen. They'd worked previously on a film called The Little Prince, which was shot in Tunisia, which is where Barry had the idea to actually shoot Star Wars in Tunisia based on his experience.
Oh,
Yep,
wow. That was his
that was,
suggestion.
yes, yeah. And so Barry really wanted to direct, get out of production design and direct. And so he wrote a number of screenplays during this period in '75. And it was while working on the film Lucky Lady with Stanley Donen in Mexico that he actually gave Donen an outline for what became Saturn 3. But originally it was called The Helper. That was the original title. Donen encouraged Barry to write a first draft, which Barry did during the production of Star Wars and Superman the movie. And so by the end of that period, Barry had a first draft called The Helper. It was quite different to what ended up being shot. It was actually the draft which got Farrah Fawcett interested in becoming involved in the movie. Just recently, I was fortunate enough to buy an actual copy of Barry's draft.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Wow. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, what were some of the major differences between Barry's draft and what actually ended up on screen?
Well, the biggest difference is that it actually takes place on Earth.
Oh, well, that's huge.
Yeah. It actually takes place in a kind of a desert environment, which is heavily irradiated. So there's been some kind of, cataclysm. Yeah,
Nuclear
yeah,
conflict.
which plays into the story. That's kind of an important part to the story. And so the other major difference is that the character that Farrah Fawcett ended up playing has way more agency in this original draft. Really, she is the lead character in Barry's draft. Kirk Douglas's character is kind of more to the side, and it's really more about Farrah Fawcett's character, which is, I guess, is why Farrah Fawcett was drawn to the script, because she had a lot to do in Barry's version. She wasn't just kind of like, a damsel in distress. She was,
Hmm.
first and foremost the protagonist of the story. Yeah.
Fascinating. And was it always a May December romance, even in this early draft, or did that come about, after like Kirk Douglas got on board?
Absolutely, it was there from the very beginning. Yeah, absolutely. And that carried on through. And this is kind of what Barry wanted to pursue, he wanted to explore the May December romance. People complaining about Kirk Douglas being older than Farrah, well, that's the story. That is the actual story. So, yeah, it was there from the very beginning. The other interesting thing is that the character that Harvey Keitel played in Barry's draft was not a psychopath whatsoever. He was a normal guy. And in fact, it was Farrah's character who was interested in his character, in kind of leaving the Kirk Douglas character and going off with the Harvey Keitel character. And of course, Harvey Keitel's character in just Barry's draft was kind of unaware of this, but it was subconscious in a way, and this is what transferred to the robot. So this is why the robot fell in love with Farrah's character.
Wow. Okay. So there's definitely seeds of very much of what ended up being in the actual film. Very different environment, different chemistry between the three characters. That's fascinating. I'm guessing Martin Amis, once he got involved, the author Martin Amis, Is he the one that kind of set it on a moon of Saturn and all that kind of stuff?
Interestingly enough, I just discovered a couple of years ago through finding a new unknown draft, basically, by a screenwriter named Evan Hunter, who was best known for writing Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds.
Oh.
And so he actually did a draft in 1978, yeah, soon after Barry completed his draft. And that was when it was transferred to Saturn's moon, Tethys. Interestingly enough, in Barry's draft, to kind of maintain the Gothic quality of it, third act takes place during a lightning and thunderstorm. So to give you that kind of,
Oh, wow.
yeah. And this is something that carried on to Evan Hunter's draft. So on this moon, there was actually an atmosphere. Of course, Tethys doesn't have an atmosphere. But
Right.
having said that, Titan does have an atmosphere. So it's kind of interesting that they carried that on with Hunter's draft. I mean, they're very similar. His draft is very similar to Barry's draft. It's virtually the same, aside from a couple of different things, the setting being the main thing. But also the dynamics between the three characters was slightly changed as well. So in Hunter's draft, Harvey Keitel's character became more lascivious towards Farrah's character. Farrah's character was kind of pulled by him, by his advances. But she kind of comes around, like halfway through the draft, she comes around to his advances and they end up getting it on, basically, which, it was so different from Barry's draft and what we ended up with in the shooting draft. The other thing is that in both Barry's draft and Hunter's draft, Kirk Douglas's character, he doesn't sacrifice himself to save Farrah. He's basically killed by the robot. And so it's up to Farrah in the third act to face off against Hector, or what became Hector. He was actually called Victor in Hunter's draft.
More Frankenstein
That's
DNA.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Wow.
In Barry's draft, the robot was actually called Frank.
Very on the nose,
Yes.
Mr. Barry, very on the nose. Okay, wow, that is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. So this is so much more gothic. It has the gothic undertones, but it was even more overtly gothic in its early drafts.
Absolutely, and the whole kind of world building with the situation on Earth being a kind of a polyamorous society, that was really late in the production, and I suspect that was introduced by Amos after Hunter's draft. And I suspect once Kirk Douglas was cast, Amos was brought in at probably Douglas's request, to make his character more proactive and kind of diminish Farrah's character, which is what ended up happening in the shooting draft. So that's why Farrah's character is really just, like I said, a damsel in distress. She's not this kind of proactive heroine with agency as what happened later in the 80s, with Sarah Connor and Ripley and so forth. So her character was kind of groundbreaking, really, if they continued down that track. But unfortunately, it was Kirk Douglas's persona that kind of got in the way.
Yeah, and in so many ways on this production, from the sounds of it. So, from my understanding, if I've read your site correctly, Lou Grade, the investor and producer of the film, he had a copy of this, The Helper. He handed it to Farrah Fawcett on a plane ride. And then he attached Farrah Fawcett to this project when he didn't even own the project yet. He didn't even have any rights to it. And then him and Stanley Donen basically made a deal for it, and that's kind of what really got the ball rolling initially. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, it's fantastic that Farrah is first billed in the credits in the opening titles. Like, all power to her, because she was really the person who got the ball rolling. Really, there was a famous interview with Johnny Carson back in the 80s where Farrah mentions her interest in the original draft, in Barry's draft, the one she read on the plane, and was kind of bemoaning the fact that it was rewritten, and so the film that was ended up in production wasn't the film she signed on for, really.
So now this production has been greenlit. It sounds like originally John Barry had wanted, it's probably a much smaller film initially, but now that Farrah Fawcett's attached, now that Kirk Douglas is attached, and Harvey Keitel, it's become a much larger production. He's a first-time director. He'd done some second unit stuff, but he was just one of the most, renowned production designers in the business. Can you talk a little bit about John Barry and sort of the early parts of the production and kind of what happened with him?
Part of the reason why I wanted to set up the site was to set the story straight as far as Barry's departure from the film, because there was all this innuendo going on around the time the film came out that he was fired, that he was incompetent, and he didn't know what he was doing, and he was out of his depth, and all this stuff. And it just wasn't the case at all. He was a very capable director, and everyone who worked on the crew sang his praises. He was just a really nice guy to work with, and very clever. And it was really the robot. The problems with the robot kind of upset the production, slowed things down.
Put them well behind schedule.
Well, not that much. According to Billy Williams, who was the cinematographer, they weren't that far behind. The main problem with the robot, as I found out just recently, having talked to Colin Chilvers about it, was to do with the head, the eye stalk. That was a very sensitive piece of equipment, and the action scenes where the robot is, being thrown around, that would get damaged, and so that was the real problem. They had to keep repairing the eye stalk. Just as an aside, I know that people complain about this robot not having a head, but that was always there from the very beginning. That in Barry's draft, he describes it this way, as being a humanoid robot with no head and with kind of an eye stalk to give it that kind of uncanny feel, But so it was the problems with the robot, and of course, this caused Kirk Douglas to get impatient, and he felt that Barry was spending too much time with the special effects and not, giving the actors as much direction. Yeah, it was Kirk Douglas who was basically stirring the pot, and probably wanted Barry off the production, which Douglas had done before. He'd done this during Spartacus.
Oh yes, yeah. He's tried to strong arm Kubrick, but a little harder to do that.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. And so Stanley Donen stepped in, kind of placate Douglas, and so Donen was there on set to kind of shepherd things along. And of course, Barry felt he was, kind of upset by this. He kind of felt he was being mollycoddled, I guess. It was kind of unwarranted, and he just couldn't work the producer on set, basically micromanaging the shoot. So after 2 weeks, Barry left. He walked off the set, and it was on a Tuesday this happened. And so it's kind of been intimated that Douglas took over some of the directing for the next couple of days for the rest of that week, until Donen stepped in the following week and became the director himself. This was a huge blow to Barry. He was crushed. This was his baby.
I'm sure. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah. He was so depressed, as you would be, and especially because he'd left The Empire Strikes Back, which was also in production, which Barry had worked on, in the production design, and left to direct Saturn3. When he was fired from Saturn3, he actually, I only found out recently, he went to the Caribbean for a holiday, which is kind of suggested that's where he contracted meningitis.
Oh, okay, interesting. And then he got back on the set of The Empire Strikes Back, I believe. Was he a second unit director, I believe?
That's right. During the Hoth hangar shooting, so all those fantastic kind of newsreel style footage of the speeders being prepared and the rebels preparing for battle, that was all Barry who shot that. Which is why it looks so fantastic. It's
amazing. Yeah, it looks absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And then I believe he passed away just a few weeks into production on The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, so he was only back for 2 weeks. That's when he collapsed. With a fever of 105, and
oh my gosh,
he was taken to the hospital, and he died 2 o'clock the next morning. He was 43 years old.
Tragic. That's terrible. It's such a true tragic loss. Let's actually talk about the funeral for a minute, because I believe they shut down production. Folks like Irwin Kershner and Stanley Donen and other folks attended John Barry's funeral.
Yeah, including Stanley Kubrick, of course, who worked with him on Clockwork Orange. He was so loved by everyone,
Yeah, I mean, he was the top production designer in Hollywood. So, yeah. I mean, it's really tragic. So, production is kind of carrying on at this point. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the troubled aspects of the production of Saturn3?
Well, of course, Barry leaving didn't fix the problems with the robot. That they still continued. With Donen in charge, so that there was that issue. They did eventually rectify the situation and were able to, speed up the time it took to work with the robot. There are other things like, for example, Harvey Keitel's costume that fantastic costume with all the tubes, very organic looking. Those tubes kept popping off, so so they kept having to glue them back on again. So that was a minor thing. But apart from that, it kind of did go quite smoothly. I mean, there were rewrites happening on set the entire
Hmm.
time, particularly after Barry's leaving in the days following that. There was massive rewrites. So I have a copy of the shooting draft and just going through that and just looking at, wow, there's a good third of it was rewritten on the set. And according to Martin Amis, he wasn't involved in these rewrites. It was actually another writer called Frederick Raphael, who worked with Stanley Donen on a film called Two for the Road. And Raphael was also best known for much later writing Eyes Wide Shut for Stanley Kubrick. So,
Wow.
yeah. So Raphael was apparently according to Martin Amis, he was on set doing rewrites. Aside from that, the production kind of did go smoothly until the end.
And there's quite a few deleted scenes in this film. There's one especially notorious scene which involves Farrah Fawcett in a rather kind of kinky piece of lingerie. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the other deleted scenes that didn't make it into the final cut of this film?
Interesting, because that scene in the shooting draft of the screenplay was one of the scenes that were rewritten after Barry's leaving. So that scene, I'm guessing, wasn't actually in Barry's the shooting draft Barry was working with, which is kind of interesting. Farrah was never happy doing that. She felt,
I imagine not.
no, she kind of felt exploited, as you would, and it was just so far from the character she signed on to, originally. And so she kind of, expressed to Donen that she felt uncomfortable. And so I'm guessing this is why it was ultimately cut from the US release. But interestingly, it did actually appear in other parts of the world, including Australia, where I saw it. So when I saw it at the drive-in in 1980, it had that scene in the film.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I know it was used for a lot of the posters in Europe and other countries as well. It kind of featured heavily. She's in this sort of, sci-fi leather outfit in the front, for the sex appeal factor. When it, in the American release, it's not even there.
Yeah. It's actually it's in the German release. So if you buy the German Blu-ray release of Saturn 3, they actually put it back into the movie, because it was so, remembered by the German audiences. I think it was also in the Japanese release as well. And so that's kind of interesting. The other thing about that scene is there's actually a murder that happens right after that, which has been cut and lost, unfortunately. That footage has been lost. So what happens in that scene is, Kirk Douglas and Farrah are kind of, taking the Blue Dreamers, and they're having this kind of crazy drug-fueled kind of moment. And Harvey Keitel kind of bursts in, interrupts them, and Kirk Douglas gets involved in an argument with Harvey Keitel's character and actually grabs like a water vase and smashes it and actually stabs Keitel in the neck with it and kills him, in cold blood. Then it's up to Farrah and Kirk to kind of dispose of the body. And as they drag the body towards the door to get rid of him, the door opens and the robot walks in. And then we cut to actual reality, and none of that happened. It's just hallucination. Yeah, basically. Yeah. Very interesting. I mean, I'd love to see that footage. There are stills you can find of that sequence, the murder sequence. Oddly enough, there were kind of lobby cards made with shots of that, which is kind of odd because it was in no print anywhere. So it might have been like a last minute cut. I mean, interestingly enough, the third, the shooting draft is way more violent than any of the previous drafts. The opening scene where Benson disposes of Captain James in space, that's shocking. As a 15-year-old watching that was just like, oh my God.
Try being a 5-year-old watching that. So yeah, I think that's about how old I was when I saw this film.
Yeah. And also the other missing scene, famously, is where Hector the robot actually pulls Benson apart in a kind of kind of a redo of the way that he was taken apart.
And we only see a little bit of that because we sort of see Harvey Keitel lose his hand and then he gets drug off. But then that's where that scene would have taken place, right? Where he would have been sort of torn to pieces on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, that scene is missing as well. It's odd too that there was a TV version released some years later after the theatrical release, and it was only screened once in the US, and I think it was NBC. And of course, back in those days, they used to incorporate cut footage back into the body of films.
Oh yeah, for the length, for the stuff they had to cut out for TV.
That's right, yeah. So that was the other thing I really wanted from creating the site, was to try and get in touch with a fan who may have recorded that version on VHS. As it turned out, that exactly happened. Like a fan who was based in Seattle named Bob, who was a massive Farrah Fawcett fan, contacted me and he said, I recorded that version on television during that one-off screening, late 80s maybe.
And he still had the tape?
He had the tape in his basement in a box. And and I said, can you digitize that and send it to me? That'd be fantastic. And he did. And so that was just so much fun watching this. It had an extra 10 minutes, it wasn't just bits and pieces. It was a whole sequence from the middle of the film that was cut out, where Kirk Douglas's character takes Hector out onto the surface to try and train him on how to collect samples, and Hector's just not interested, and so makes his way back into the base, and that's where he attacks Farrah, basically. And so it's up to Douglas to break his way back into the base and come to the rescue. The other thing about that TV cut is that Hector is way more sympathetic in that version. We actually feel sorry for him because Douglas is constantly berating him and putting him down, and just being a real, jerk. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that was maybe taken out to, take away the sympathy.
Make Kirk Douglas look better.
Yeah.
So it sounds like he had a lot of sway on this film throughout the process, even into post.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating. Well, I would love to see that scene sometime.
It's actually
very interesting.
It's actually on the Blu-ray.
Oh, it is? Yeah. Excellent. I will have to check that out.
Yeah, because I contacted Screen Factory and told them this, and they said that I've got this footage. They actually put it on the Blu-ray as extras. And they did a really good job, too, incorporating it back into the body of the film.
All right, Greg. Well, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for walking us through kind of the behind-the-scenes history of the film. At this point, why don't we talk a little bit about the film itself? Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the film? Why it's held such a fascination for you all this time?
Yeah, as I said before, it's kind of a combination of gothic horror and space, I love everything about it. I love the look, I love the sound, I love the direction, I love the editing. Fantastic editing by Richard Martin, I just watched it recently again and just appreciated how great the editing is in that film.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It really is.
Especially during the scene where they where the dismantled Hector puts himself back together again. That is just amazing.
Yeah. So cool with all the little robots he's summoning and to help reassemble him.
And using reverse photography, and it's just so well done. So clever. Again, with the editing, with Hector's demise, where he's blown up at the end, and all that super slow photography, the 1,000 frames a second photography.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like all the soap suds, all these different parts of the robot flying up, and the sound that it's absolutely mesmerizing.
Yeah.
That has always stuck in my head, that particular moment, because it's so unique. I think you'd mentioned on your site that particular scene was inspired by Antonioni's Zabriskie Point, where they blow up the house
That's
in
right.
the canyon, which is brilliant, because that's also like amazing, because that house explosion, it just goes on forever if you've ever seen Zabriskie Point.
Yeah.
And it just, all these different parts are flying around, and this like great music is playing and stuff.
That's the other thing with Saturn3 is the amazing score by Elmer Bernstein.
It's fantastic. I actually listened to, they have it on YouTube, the entire score. There's a lot of it that's very disco. And some of that, I think you said, ended up in heavy metal, like about a year or so later.
Yeah.
That's just so cool.
If you actually listen to the track on that CD, or on YouTube. It's the opening title sequence, and if you sync it up to the movie, you can actually see what they originally had in mind with incorporating that theme, which was written as Alex's theme or Farah's character's theme, which was repurposed later for the Tana sequence in the heavy metal movie. So it's the same theme, but it's just fascinating seeing these different cues in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's such an eclectic score as well. Like the instruments that Bernstein uses, just a whole array of different sounds. It's incredible.
It's wild, yeah. It's quite iconic. It's a fantastic score from beginning to end. I mean, there is one drawback to this movie, and it's the visual effects. I don't know how you feel about those. I was reading on your site because they've always kind of bugged me because I was like, everything else is so high quality, from the sets to the design of Hector the robot. He's like one of the most incredible looking robots I've ever seen on screen. And yet, when it cuts to VFX shots in the film, they don't quite have like the same level of quality and stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you feel about those.
Well, I mean, there's a reason for that, and that is that there was a movie that Grade was producing at the same time called Raise the Titanic.
Terrible film.
Yeah. It is a terrible film, yeah. And that film was going way over budget. In order to save that movie, they took away the visual effects budget for Saturn3 and basically used that money to try and save the Titanic. It didn't end up happening anyway, And so that's why the visual effects in Saturn3 are kind of lackluster, mostly.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of good shots in there,
Yeah, no, and there's some interesting stuff. You could tell, I guess, that they were hamstringed and they just did what they could, I think, with it. But there's certainly once again, though, the design of the ship. Harvey Keitel originally comes over. It's almost bug-like in its look. It looks like a fly's head or something. It's great. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I believe, is it Stuart Craig? This is like his first actual production designer role. He was John Barry's art director.
That's right.
Forever. And for folks out there, Stuart Craig is actually one of the top production designers in Hollywood. He did the entire Harry Potter series, amongst other, Oscar winners like English Patient and Gandhi, etc. Yeah, and this was his first actual credit as a production designer, I believe.
And the set, that amazing set.
Incredible.
That set was the biggest, at the time, the biggest indoor set ever built in the UK, And it was
Wow.
And it was built in Shepperton Studios, and actually had two sound stages connected to incorporate that huge set, because it was all just one gigantic set. It was, it wasn't a room here and a room there, and in fact, people got lost in the first few days of being there, because it was just, like a rabbit warren, really. So they had a map, the architect's blueprints on.
Find your way out.
Yeah.
I want to go get some craft services. How do I get back to the donuts?
Yeah.
I think the similar thing happened on the production of Alien well.
Yeah.
That particular set was quite large and was entirely enclosed. Because Scott wanted that sort of claustrophobic feel with it, and they had to do the same thing. They had to put up little maps for folks to get in and out.
That's the other interesting thing about the movie is that people, when the film came out, they were just accusing Saturn3 of ripping off Alien, which is just not the truth at all, because Alien was the production in Shepperton prior to Saturn3. So when Alien moved out, Saturn3 moved in. And of course, Barry had written Saturn3 in 75, so there's no way it was a rip-off of Alien. It was just, people assuming that. That set became actually a kind of a draw card for celebrities. They'd take their friends to go and visit the set. People like one of the Python, I think Michael Palin or someone like that, visited the set once, because it was this famous set that was just enormous,
Yeah.
But it really adds to the kind of the sense of being there. The immersion is really there.
Yeah, it's all so unique, and something we haven't touched on actually is Harvey Keitel's performance in this. Which, when I was a kid, I didn't realize this because I didn't know, I hadn't seen a lot of Harvey Keitel films when I was a young kid. But he is entirely dubbed.
Yeah.
In this film. Could you talk a little bit about that? Did they just not like his accent, his Brooklyn accent, and they decided to bring in an English actor to dub him? Or what was the story behind that?
Having read the Evan Hunter draft, It's actually mentioned in there that that character has an English accent. It's actually in the script. So it's kind of odd that they would hire Harvey Keitel, who has a Brooklyn accent,
Yeah.
to play that role. I mean, there's different versions of the story of why his voice was replaced. Some say, he was so fed up with the production that he just didn't want to come back for ADR. He just wanted to be done with it. And there's others who say that Donen wanted, a more mid-Atlantic accent as opposed to his Brooklyn accent. And so that's why he was replaced. But I had no idea either, because I didn't really know who Harvey Keitel was. I was too young to see Taxi Driver and,
Main Streets
yeah, yeah. So and for a long time, I thought it was him. I thought it was his voice.
Yeah, same. I thought that's just how Harvey Keitel talked until probably high school when I started to actually see a lot more Harvey Keitel films.
Yeah.
It's bizarre now when I watch it. I'm like, oh my God, it's like that doesn't sound anything like Harvey Keitel.
But I mean,
the ADR is great though. I gotta say, they did a fantastic. It's quite seamless.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And Roy Dotrice was the actor who revoiced that character. He was probably best known at the time for the TV series Space 1999. He had some guest roles in there. He was also the father of Michelle Dotrice, who at the time was also an actress. She appeared in a TV series called Some Mothers Do Have 'Em with Michael Crawford. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I don't think so.
Okay, yeah, it's a fantastic ADR. Like you wouldn't even really know that he was
seamless.
Yeah.
It really is. The performances are all really great in it. It's interesting that it is this sort of trinity of actors that are at the heart of this, and they're all three very strong actors in their own right. I also remember this had such an impact on me as a kid because of how macabre it is. I mean, there's a scene where like Hector has Harvey Keitel's head on top of his head and he's talking in, Keitel's character's voice. Did some of these things just linger with you like they did with me? They like really, really disturbing imagery in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that scene with the head on top of the eye stalk, that was there from Barry's original draft. That was always there, that he would pretend to be alive. But the film is, looking back at it, it is kind of gory.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty violent in parts.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Like as I said, the opening murder sequence, and then you've got Harvey Keitel's hand being cut off, and the dog being torn in half, and it's just but none of this was really in the previous drafts. Perhaps the most violent thing that happened in the early drafts was Kirk Douglas's character's death. He actually falls into that pit, the sludge pit in the lab. He actually falls into there and starts disintegrating because of this kind of acidic liquid that's in that pit.
Oh, wow. It's like melting.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
It's kind of like that scene in RoboCop where the character...
Yeah. The toxic sludge gets all over the guy. Wow. And they didn't film any of that, did they? Or that was just... It was in the script, but they didn't actually ever spend the money on the effects.
No, because, it had changed that they actually made it that it was Kirk who finally kills Hector. So that was all changed. So violent. But I mean, that was the appeal as well as a 15-year-old,
yeah, of course. Yeah. It's interesting too, because like the opening shot is straight out of Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
You have the spaceship coming right over top of the camera. All of the starship and the original Star Wars film as well.
Yeah.
But this is interesting too because Stanley Donen, and for folks out there who don't know who Stanley Donen is, Stanley Donen's probably famous for, he's the director of Singing in the Rain, directed probably 50, 60 films or so. I mean, he was kind of from that old classic Hollywood mold where, these directors, they would direct 2 or 3 films a year, It's pretty wild. And, but so Donen definitely was very skilled, but he'd never done a sci-fi film before. And he was just kind of thrown into this. And it's extremely competently made throughout, but it is interesting that this like classic old Hollywood director ended up at the helm of this as well.
Yeah. I mean, Donen, people remember Singing in the Rain, but he dabbled in pretty much every genre.
Yeah.
Like Charade and Bedazzled, the comedy with
Hmm. Yeah,
Dudley
with
Moore.
Dudley Moore. Yeah.
Yeah. I find it interesting that Saturn 3 was his second to last feature as a director, and that his final film, which was Blame It on Rio, um, I don't know if you remember
Probably regrets that as his
that.
final film.
But I find it interesting that film was also about a May-December
Hmm.
relationship.
Yeah, yeah. An even more disturbing one
Oh,
with Demi
absolutely.
Moore and Michael Caine.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
which I believe, I think I read this on your site, was Michael Caine was even considered for the role that Kirk Douglas
That's
ended up with.
that's right. At the time that Sean Connery was considered for the Kirk Douglas role, but of course Connery couldn't do it because of tax reasons. He couldn't come back to the UK and work.
Hiding out somewhere else in Europe.
Yeah. But in hindsight, I'd say Connery would have been a better choice for that role. And in fact, in Hunter's Draft, it's kind of the way the character is described. It's more like Connery than it would be Kirk. So it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Connery, just so folks are aware, he was still quite a bit younger than Kirk Douglas at that point too. So,
Yeah, he was only in his early 50s at that
yeah,
point.
yeah,
But the interesting thing is that Michael Caine was only a few years younger than Sean Connery at the time, so quite have worked, I don't think, in playing the younger character stealing Farrow away. But it's fascinating to think about. If Kirk wasn't cast, Barry would have survived and lived on to God knows what he would have been capable of. As a director, it's really sad. It's really sad we lost an
it's
amazing
terrible.
talent.
Yeah, it's so tragic. Which I was blissfully unaware of any of this until I ran across your site, and I think that was the piece of information that struck me the most. Is that this film has such a tragic backstory because this was John Barry's baby, going to be his big directorial debut. He'd put so much time and effort into it, and then to be kind of pushed out by, sure, it's a little nebulous, like who pushed him out, did he leave voluntarily, etc. But by all accounts, especially what you've told us, it sounds like he was most likely pushed out, probably by Kirk
Yeah,
Douglas.
yeah.
But yeah, it is truly a terrible, tragic story. Any other parting thoughts about Saturn 3?
I'm so glad that in the years since the Blu-ray's been out, that people have discovered the film and that it's been preserved. Because up to that point, it was kind of had a minor release on DVD, but to now have it preserved, for people to discover and also learn the story of why it is the way it is. I think I'm very happy about that.
Same. Yeah, I had to hunt it down years and years later because it was this movie that, like I said, it was one of my dad's first films that he ever bought for his video store. So I watched this thing over and over again
Yeah,
as a kid just because it had robots and I love sci-fi. Probably shouldn't have, a bit too young for the film, but it definitely left a big impact on me and my work. And speaking of the Shout Factory Blu-ray, Shout Factory has that Blu-ray edition. You can pick it up anywhere. It's also streaming out there on Amazon Prime, Roku, and Tubi. So, Greg, where can folks find some of your film projects?
so I have a movie blog that I've been running for since 2012. So I have a whole bunch of reviews on there, and I also talk about my film productions. Have my second feature coming out very soon. It's going to have a release in the United States in March.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah.
What's the name of your latest film?
It's called Fear Below, and it's a shark movie.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
We're very happy with the way it's come out. It should be in March, I think, in the US, and it's going to have release elsewhere as well. And my other film, my first feature, which came out a couple of years ago, is called The Cost. It's a psychological thriller. At the moment, it's only streaming in Australia, but we're hoping to get it into the US as well and UK at some point. So, yeah, keep an eye out for that.
Excellent. How exciting. Very excited for to see your film work and especially your new film. Very excited so folks keep your eye out for that. All right. I will be sure to leave links in the show notes for folks to check out Greg's work as well as his amazing website that goes into all the details about the making of Saturn 3. Greg, thank you again. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for getting up so early to chat with me and stuff. I really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful conversation. You're such a bastion of knowledge about this film. You are truly the expert on this movie. So it's great that we share a love for this film. So it's really wonderful meeting you. And folks, we hope you enjoyed this bonus episode. Till next time, be kind as we rewind.